Jonah 1:1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went on board to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. There's a common misconception about prophets. The prophet in Israel does not merely foretell the future. In fact, his primary role is to admonish sinners, the king, the nation, and the leaders specifically, and call them to repentance. He is a representative of God and his covenant, and calls Israel to remain faithful to God through the covenant. He reminds them of the stipulations and points out their transgressions. He reiterates the greatness and benevolence of God, and the curses and consequences for turning away from him and breaking covenant. It was a call to holiness and an exposure of their sin. As has been the theme thus far of this study, Jonah lived the events of this book, but when he wrote them down for Israel and for us, they would serve as a prophetic reminder of those sins and a foretelling of future consequences. Jonah was given a command from God, but instead of obeying, he turned away from God. He fled in the other direction. As mentioned before, this book is literal history, but it is also prophetic and symbolic. Was Jonah fleeing to an actual city or region called Tarshish? Perhaps so, but ships of Tarshish were known as ships of trade and long voyages, so Tarshish here could be symbolic of that trade and distance. In fact, it is symbolic of reliance upon the nations and of turning away from God. When God told Israel they would be ruled by kings in Deuteronomy, he specified that the king was not to multiply wives, horses, or gold. And these are the very ways that King Solomon, for instance, disobeyed God and was led astray. His 700 foreign wives, for instance, led him to worship false gods. 1 Kings 11, verse 3. He had 700 wives, who were princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord, as David his father had done. And the Lord was angry with Solomon, because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Because of his sins he caused Israel to be divided, and the quintessential rebel, and the namesake of the king in Jonah's time, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, rose up as an adversary, and the man who split the kingdom. His name would forever be connected to that division and the idolatry of Israel. 1 Kings 11:6 tells us about Jeroboam. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zeradah, a servant of Solomon, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow, also lifted up his hand against the king. In his own disobedience, Jonah is a picture of Solomon, and being a picture of Solomon, he's actually a picture of Israel. Although Deuteronomy had said not to multiply gold, Solomon made it so plentiful in Judah that silver was as nothing. 1 Kings 10:21. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. Silver was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. Famously, he also imported so many horses and chariots that scholars doubt the huge numbers given in the Bible. Solomon even exported chariots to nations that would become his enemies, including Syria in the time of Jonah's prophecy. Regarding Tarshish, in 1 Kings 10, his ships of Tarshish made 3-year journeys to bring him the wealth of the nations. But the ships mentioned there are those of the coast of Edom at Ezion-Geber on the Gulf of Aqaba. This is not on the Mediterranean, but is on the Arabian Peninsula. 1 Kings 9, verse 6 and on. King Solomon built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Eloth on the shore of the Red Sea, in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent with the fleet of his servants seamen who were familiar with the sea, together with the servants of Solomon. And they went to Ophir and brought from there gold, 420 talents, and they brought it to King Solomon. These are not on the Mediterranean Sea, on the way to Spain, but they're on the Arabian Peninsula and on the Red Sea. These two references to Hiram's fleet at Ezion-Geber, traveling to Ophir, and to the ships of Tarshish are from the same chapter in 1 Kings. 1 Kings 10. Moreover, the fleet of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought from Ophir a great amount of almug wood and precious stones. And the king made of the almug wood supports for the house of the Lord, and for the king's house, also lyres and harps for the singers. No such almug wood has come or been seen to this day. Verse 22. For the king had a fleet of ships of Tarshish, at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years the fleet of ships of Tarshish used to come bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Peacocks, of course, come from Asia and not from Spain. Verse 25. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses and mules, so much year by year. And Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Shephelah. And Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Kue, and the king's traders received them from Kue at a price. A chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And so through the king's traders they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. As I mentioned, this has been forbidden in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 17:16 tells us about the king, only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Every one of the things that Deuteronomy 17 admonished the future king for, Solomon sinned by doing. Like Samson when he was breaking his Nazaritic vows, the Bible shows that Solomon is specifically seen to be breaking each and every one of these commands that he was given. The result, again, is to turn his heart away from God. Turning away from God is Israel's sin, and this is Solomon's sin, and this is Jonah's sin in this book, in his disobedience and his flight. When God finally judges Jerusalem, the great city of Revelation, we see that this is all tied up together. As with Hosea's wife and Isaiah's prophecy, Jerusalem in Revelation is now the adulterous woman, the harlot wife of God, who must be put away in divorce. Revelation 17:15 tells us, and the angel said to me, the waters that you saw, where the prostitute is seated, are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages, and the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked, and devour her flesh, and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out this purpose by being of one mind, and handing over their royal power to the beast, until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. Here we see that the roiling waters of the storms in the sea represent the nations, foreign peoples and languages. Notice again in Revelation 17:15. And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw, where the prostitute is seated, are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. Throughout the Old Testament, the flood waters, the seas, and boiling water are the nations sweeping over one another and over Israel in chaotic conquest. In Jeremiah, the boiling pot of water is Babylon, poured out in destruction on Assyria, in fact. So in Jonah 1, we see Jonah fleeing from God, and he's heading to Tarshish. In this sense, he is turning to the world of Tarshish. He's overthrown by the storming of the waters, which is the nations. This was Solomon's transgression, and was even seen in Isaiah in our last lesson, when he gave his oracle against Israel in the first 2 chapters of his book. Isaiah 2, verse 6, speaking to God, for you have rejected your people, the house of Jacob, because they are full of things from the east, and of fortune tellers like the Philistines, and they strike hands with the children of the foreigners. Their land is filled with silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. Their land is filled with horses, and there is no end to their chariots. Notice the direct lineage of these sins from Solomon. For the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought low, against all the ships of Tarshish, and against all the beautiful craft. That was verse 16. And we see here that Solomon's sin has been multiplying through the years of the monarchy into Isaiah's prophecy. Jonah is living out that same prophecy when he rejects God and flees to Tarshish. Israel has a near fulfillment coming in the exile to Assyria, but we see Solomon's sins manifest as well in Revelation, when Jerusalem is finally thrown down for those very same transgressions. Here, Jerusalem is the same rebellious whore of Isaiah 1. In Isaiah 1, verse 1, we saw the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Children have I reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. Verse 20, But if you refuse and rebel, you shall be eaten by the sword, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And we see a continuity here with Hosea in verse 21. How the faithful city has become a whore, she who was full of justice. They have been forsaking God, despising the Holy One of Israel, and they have been utterly estranged. And now that we see adulterous Israel reflected not only from Hosea, but Isaiah and in Revelation. Revelation 18:9 tells us, And the kings of the earth, who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her, will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. And the merchants of the earth, which look like Tarshish in the previous citations, weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo any more. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented woods, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots and slaves, that is, human souls. Verse 15, The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Verse 17, All shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea stood far off, and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? Fleeing to Tarshish, running from his call, and trying to escape God's presence, turning away from and denying God, Jonah is reenacting Israel's sin, her reliance on herself, on her wealth, and on the nations, her whoredom with nations and squandering of God's gifts, her turning to the peoples of the waters and away from God, who rescued her from them in the first place. We see prophets like Hosea, Amos, Isaiah, and Ezekiel wrapped up in this narrative of Jonah, which must be a prophecy that equals theirs. We see it all come to a head, of course, with all the same words, all the same trading in silver and gold with the nations, the same adulterous city rejecting God and turning away from him in Revelation. Jonah has to be seen as in keeping with all of these prophets.